I want to talk today a little bit about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And I think it's easy to kind of conflate the two, and they often on the surface look very similar, but they're not the same. And I would argue throughout Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, there is a lot about seeking a heart of wisdom. What does it mean to be a wise person? And I saw this meme years ago. I think it might be my favorite explanation of the difference. It says this: knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Some of you didn't know that. You're welcome. That's just a freebie. Knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. Can I get an amen? I recently saw a new addition to that, though, that said, philosophy is wondering if that means ketchup is a smoothie. Some of you will be thinking about that for like the rest of the day today. Is it technically a smoothie? My point is this. Wisdom and knowledge often will look similar, but they're not the same. And today we're going to read a story about someone that God calls a fool. Someone who is not wise in the ways of God. So just a quick overview. We're starting a new series today called Kingdom Lens, and we're going to look at 5 parables unique to the Gospel of Luke. Many of you know this. Jesus uses parables all the time to teach his listeners how to love, how to pray, how to see the world through the lens of the kingdom. That is often his objective, is to help people see, help us see through a different set of lenses. Now, the word parable simply means to cast alongside. To cast alongside. That may seem strange, but here's why I think that's important. It's about taking a new truth and casting it alongside something that's familiar. And you'll notice as you read the parables, that's often what Jesus is doing. He's like, you're familiar with a farmer or a vineyard or a mustard seed. Here's how that's like the kingdom. Here's how that relates to being a follower of Jesus. Now, even people who didn't grow up in church or grow up a Christian, you probably know a number of these parables. You probably have heard about the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son. These stories are maybe the most famous stories in the history of the world. Now, Jesus' parables are short, anywhere from 1 to 22 verses. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, roughly 35% of Jesus' teaching is in parable form. He is a storyteller and a master storyteller at that. I think that's easy for us to miss in a sort of like Western post-Enlightenment culture where we like lists and we like things to be really tidy and neat and vacuum sealed. But Jesus, and you see this throughout his ministry, someone tries to corner him and he responds with like this weird story. I say we bring that back, by the way. And the next time you're like cornered at the office, be like, oh, it's sort of like yeast and dough. And you're like, no, it's not. It's not like that at all. But Jesus often responds to questions and needs in story form. Now, Luke is filled with parables from Jesus. In fact, 2/3 of all Jesus' parables are in the Gospel of Luke. 18 of those parables are unique to the Gospel of Luke. We're not going to go through all of them. We're only going to look at 5. But the first is in Luke chapter 12. And I don't typically title sermons. I'm just not very good at it. But the kind of working title for this one is this. I'm calling it The Dangers of Blessings. The dangers of blessings. And perhaps you're wondering, how in the world can blessings be dangerous? I'm so glad you asked, hypothetical congregant. We'll get there in a second. Luke chapter 12, here's kind of the context. Luke tells us that Jesus is preaching to a crowd of many thousands. So I want us to go with that kind of visual. There are many thousands of people who have come to hear this peculiar rabbi named Jesus. And he's talking to the crowds about issues like heaven and hell, judgment and forgiveness, fear and faithfulness. And then in the middle of Jesus' message, a man kind of, I imagine him like elbows his way to the front and interrupts Jesus in the middle of his teaching. And here's how it begins, verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher." Okay, so it's a little weird. Like in the middle of his teaching, someone like interrupts him and addresses him in front of the crowd. But so far, like he's doing pretty good, right? He recognizes Jesus as a teacher, addresses him as a teacher. And he goes on, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, we're not given any background or context to this guy, but it was obvious that he was in some sort of legal dispute with his brother over the estate that their father had left them. That was not uncommon. But I want you to notice the tone here. He doesn't say, beg your pardon, Jesus, if you could, or would you mind offering some insight, or could you help in this matter? What does he say? Just demands it of him. Teacher, tell my brother to do this thing. Like, it's very odd. It's sort of a coarse way of addressing Jesus. He just demands that he do this thing for him. And here's how Jesus replies. Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter between you? I like to interpret this as sort of like surfer Jesus, like, man, I don't think that's accurate, by the way. I don't think that's what's going on here. But Jesus is essentially saying, why are you involving me in this? Like, what are you doing? Now, it's worth noting that Jesus is not indifferent to matters of injustice, quite the opposite. You see Jesus' heart for justice again and again and again. But here's why I think this beginning of this story is so important. Sometimes the most loving thing Jesus can do is derail what we are demanding of him. Sometimes we come to Jesus the way that this man does, and we say, Jesus, do this thing for me. Make this thing happen. Sometimes it's even with very good motives. Sometimes the most loving thing Jesus can do is to derail us from the things we are demanding of him. Jesus is not here to fulfill our agenda or answer our demands. He is the Messiah, not a mascot. And we would do well to be mindful of any of the times that we come to Jesus, the King of Kings, demanding that our way be followed. Jesus shows us pretty explicitly here that's not what he came to do. Next verse. Then he said to them. Now this is also important because who's the them? It's the crowds now, right? So this man elbows his way to the front. He makes this demand of Jesus. He says, man, why do you involve me, right? And then he turns to who? He turns to the crowd of people gathered. He's now talking to everyone. He's going to issue a warning to all of them, and I would argue to all of us. Goes on. Then he said to them, watch out, be on guard against all kinds of greed. So apparently the issue with the man isn't justice, it's greed. It masquerades as justice, but beneath the surface, the real issue is greed. One commentator defines greed as the insatiable lust for more. I think lust is actually a really good word for it. If love and lust are opposites, and I think they are, it means love is patient and lust is always in a hurry. Lust is this insatiable appetite for more. That's what greed does to our hearts. And apparently, notice this, there are all different kinds of greed. Jesus doesn't say, be on guard against greed. He could have. Instead, he says, be on guard against all different kinds of greed, which is to say, the kind you think you're doing well to avoid is probably just one kind. Some of us maybe today we're thinking like, oh yeah, this message is going to be a cakewalk for me. I'm not greedy at all because I have this definition. And she's just saying, no, there's a whole myriad of kinds of greed. Be on guard. Now, in the original Greek, this warning to be on guard is in what's called the present imperative, which means Jesus is imploring us to stay in a constant state of vigilance against greed. He's saying, do not let your guard down here. The threat is constant. Like imagine this. Imagine if someone came to your house this afternoon and they said, hey, there's been a string of robberies like in our actual neighborhood and they're impartial. They're just hitting every house. Doesn't matter if it's the biggest house, the smallest house, nice car in the driveway. They're hitting all of the houses. Most of us would spring into action today to guard against that, wouldn't we? Most of you'd already be on your way to Lowe's. You'd be buying a new security system, something. You'd be jumping into action. Most of us wouldn't say, the robberies are happening here right now? Yeah, I'll get to that. I'll take care of that somewhere down the road. When Jesus says, watch out, be on guard, he's not saying, if you have some spare time in the future, if you have nothing else going on, I guess, maybe this would be a good thing to be on guard against. He's saying it's an issue in the neighborhood of your heart now. Right now. Be on guard. And the reason why comes next. Then he said to them, watch out, be on guard against all kinds of greed, because life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Now note, and you'll hear me say this a couple of times, Jesus is not saying that stuff is bad. He's just saying that's not where true life is found. Life abundantly is not found in the accumulation of stuff, getting a bigger and bigger pile. Maybe for you, it's not a pile of stuff. Maybe it's accolades. Maybe it's platform. Maybe it's the vacation that people are envious of. Whatever it is, as good as all of those things can be, saying that's actually not where the abundant life is found. He's saying we are greedy because we've bought into the lie that stuff is what we need to live a good life. But the writer of Ecclesiastes calls it a chasing after the wind. James says it's like a vapor. It's like the steam off your coffee right now. That's life. It's here, and then it's gone. Now, this is the point where, like, a lot of us kind of nod in agreement because we know, at least intellectually, like, money won't bring you happiness, right? Have you guys heard some version of that? I heard a comedian years ago. He's like, yeah, money can't buy you happiness, but it can buy you a jet ski. And have you ever seen anyone frown on a jet ski? So that's how a lot of us tend to reason. Like, sure, it won't bring me happiness, but it can help me purchase the things that bring me happiness, or it at least gives me the peace of mind that I'm at least secure, that I'm safe. We will still default to it, either for security or approval, or maybe your reason is something else, and Jesus says, be on guard. Verse 16, and then he told them this parable. So this is Jesus responding with a story. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. I love that we don't know who the rich man is, and I love that, like, at first blush, he's not done anything wrong. Nothing to warrant the title fool yet, right? He's doing well for himself. Verse 17 goes on, he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. This is a problem that a lot of us would love to have, isn't it? Here's a guy who's like, you know what? Things are going too well for me. Anyone have a friend like that? Like, their worst complaint is like, I would love for that to be my problem. Like, I have so much extra crop, I don't even know where to store it, right? I'm sure some of us are like, world's smallest violin. What a rough life that you have. But this guy so far is kind of living what many of us see as successful. Now, this question here, what should I do with all this excess, would be really obvious in the first century. In the first century, the obvious answer would be, if you have a surplus, care for the poor. Care for the marginalized. If you have extra, build a longer table, not a taller fence. Like that would have been understood. That's not what he does, though. The parable continues. Then he said, this is what I'll do. He's talking to himself. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, he's literally talking to himself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Again, brief caveat. I don't believe Jesus is saying it's wrong to save for a rainy day or retirement or inheritance for your kids. I think Jesus is asking us, are you valuing your relationship with God or ease in life? He's asking them and us, what is your highest priority? What is the aim, the telos, the trajectory of your life? Can we just be honest for a moment? Like, don't we all kind of envy him? Isn't this all what we would sort of love to have happen in our life? Things are going so well, and then this guy literally has enough where he can just sort of like live out his days. I saw a sticker recently and it says, I have enough to live on for the rest of my life as long as I die on Tuesday, right? Like, some of us look at him, you're like, you're at the point in your life where you just kick back and take it easy? That sounds awesome. Not only awesome, that is the goal. That is the dream. Some of us at this point in the story look at this man's life and think, exactly. That's what I'm shooting for. That's what I long for. And yet God's going to call him a fool. How can we and God think so differently? And who's more likely to be right? One could easily argue that the rich man is wise and responsible. He's obviously very smart. He has a lot of knowledge. He's got a thriving farming business. His land is produced so abundantly that he doesn't have enough storage space in his barn, so he pulls them down to build bigger ones, and then he'll have ample savings to live out his days and enjoy his golden years. Isn't that what we are all encouraged to strive for? Isn't it wise and responsible to do that? The rich farmer would probably have been a good financial advisor. He seems to have things figured out. He's worked hard, he's saved wisely, and now he can sit back, relax, and enjoy the fruits of his labor, right? Not exactly. In all of his planning, in all of his knowledge, there's one thing that he had not planned for, and that's meeting God. Verse 20. But God said to him, "You fool." This is like the Mr. T part of the Bible, right? I pity the fool. That's a throwaway. I don't know about you. I don't want to be someone that God says, "You fool," to. You fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Hold on to that phrase, rich toward God. We'll come back to that. The rich farmer is not a fool. He's a fool not because he is wealthy or because he saves for the future, but because he appears to only live for himself. That's what makes him foolish. You'll notice so far there's like no gratitude to God for this abundance. He's not thinking about anybody else but himself, about serving other people. He's not thinking about eternity in any sense of the word. He thought that he had nothing but time to live out his days. I would say it this way. This is less about how much stuff you have and more about how much your stuff has you. Taking stock of not how much you have or how much you stock, whatever that is, how much of my stuff has a stranglehold on my heart, of my will, of my soul. So a quick list for those of you who are kind of list-taking types or note-taking types, this might be helpful. According to Jesus, when blessed with more, fools do these 5 things. First, they think only about themselves. In 9 verses, there are 12 personal pronouns. I, me, my, over again. This guy, when blessed with more, he only thinks about himself, what he will do to secure his comfort. Secondly, fools think to increase control, not trust. Isn't that how it tends to work for us? The more that I have, the more secure I feel. This is the pursuit for many of us, that I can be in control. Third, fools think like a pond, not a river. This is a series we did a few months back. We were not meant to be ponds of blessings, but rivers of blessings, to bring blessing and life and hope and healing wherever we go, not to hoard it, not to store it for ourselves, to be rivers, not ponds. When given more, when blessed with more, fools think about comfort, not calling. They think only about our ease, our comfort. And again, I don't think God is anti-comfort, but I'll just say it this way. I sometimes think our comfort is in direct opposition to our true calling. I think if we are obsessed with the pursuit of how comfortable I can be, that is in many ways in direct opposition to the calling that God has in our life. And lastly, when blessed with more, fools think about now, not eternity. Now again, obviously there's the wisdom to like being present here and now. Like, God, what have you given me? I want to steward that well. But Jesus is saying a fool thinks only about now, has no sense of eternity. Not only where I'm going, but where everyone else is. Like, what does it mean to actually have eternity in perspective? And this is worth noting too. You do not have to be wealthy to be greedy. This is not like simply or strictly for anyone who considers himself wealthy. I heard a parable years ago, and the parable goes something like this. Even the smallest coin can block out the sun if it's close enough to your eye. You think about like a penny. Think about how small this is, right? And if I hold it out like this, it's pretty small. I can still see most of you, like except for you, sir. There's nothing personal, I promise. Out here, like it obscures a little bit. But if I bring it all the way up here, well now it's obscuring a lot. Now it's mostly all I can see. Even the smallest coin can blot out the sun if it's close enough to our eyes, close enough to our heart. And for you, honestly, it might not even be wealth. The thing you're greedy for might not be money or possessions at all. You might feel like totally free in that area. But whatever we're greedy for will train us to think that we are at the center. That's how you'll know. Whatever it is that we are greedy for will train our minds and our will to believe that this is ultimately about me. My comfort, my success, my accolades. Fill in your own blank. That's how greed works. And again, what Jesus is not saying is that there's anything inherently wrong with possessions or savings. In fact, those things can be very good. By the standards of their era and culture, Abraham, Job, David, especially Solomon, were all incredibly affluent. And throughout church history, numerous wealthy people have used their resources to advance the work of the gospel in the world. And not just even throughout church history, I just got to say it, in this church, There are just some incredibly generous people in our community. Sometimes it brings me to tears sometimes. Like the generosity of this community is remarkable. Like please hear me say that. Some of you are using whatever God has given you in some profoundly beautiful ways. Jesus is simply saying that the abundant life is not found in accumulation. It's not found in getting more and more and more, but in self-sacrificing kingdom love. Do you know that Jesus spends something like a quarter of his earthly ministry talking about our stuff, our wealth, our possessions? Sometimes in churches, people will say things like, why are we talking about money in church? Shouldn't we be talking about spiritual things? And I would say, my friend, if you're at a place where you're more spiritual than Jesus, we need to realign some things. Jesus seems to believe that what we do here and now with our stuff matters. If we want to submit our ways towards apprenticeship to Jesus, to be with and become like him, it means taking his words about our possessions, our money, and our stuff seriously. In fact, it shows up throughout the Gospels. Here are just a couple of examples that maybe you've heard of. Acts 20, it's more blessed to give than receive. Matthew 6, you cannot serve both God and money. Also Matthew 6, where your treasure is, there your heart is. John Mark Comer makes the observation that these are not commands, these are just statements of reality. These are not commands. He's not saying, you should not serve both God and money. It's saying you just can't. If money, if possessions, if that is your ultimate bullseye, that will be in direct conflict to what it means to have a heart surrendered to Jesus and his kingdom. You can't do it. It doesn't work that way. Here in Luke 12, Jesus isn't even accusing this man of acquiring his wealth illicitly. As far as we can tell, there's no bribery, no theft, no mistreatment of workers. Jesus is not telling us a story of an unjust man. He's telling a story of a foolish one. So what makes him foolish? What makes this man so foolish that God would say, fool? This is a story about the folly of a life solely focused on building bigger barns. About being rich, but not rich toward God. Maybe we could say it this way. Many of us think a lot more about our possessions than God's presence. And just to say it, that includes me. I am not, again, speaking from an area of I've arrived, I've achieved total zen. None of this matters to me at all. But a lot of us think way more about our possessions than God's presence. You see, this rich fool was living under a rubric that I think a lot of us would agree with. His philosophy in life was this: wealth plus many years equals a full life. We maybe wouldn't say it that simply, but for a lot of us, that's exactly how we were living. As long as I get a bunch of stuff, a bunch more things, long years, many years ahead, that's the abundant life. Jesus says no. He says it's not true, and to be on guard against that type of thinking, against all kinds of greed. And the New Testament, by the way, is filled with instructions to be on guard against greed. Here are a few. Romans 1:29, Colossians 3:5, Ephesians 4:19, 2 Peter 2:14. I'd encourage you, just read a few of these on your own time. And I share that to say this, that anytime a theme shows up this many times in Scripture, at the very least we should pay attention to it. It's so fascinating to me how sometimes we'll get hyper-focused on one thing that shows up one time to one person in the New Testament. This topic of greed shows up again and again and again and again. It's because Jesus knows this is an indication that something is going on at the heart level. Wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart is. It's the dashboard light flashing and say, hey, you don't have a light issue, you got something beneath the hood. Something's not right. Be on guard. Anything talked about that much, at the very least, is worthy of our consideration. I love the way that C.S. Lewis put it. He says, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world could satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If you're here and you resonate with man, I keep feeding this monster, I'm running on this treadmill, I keep thinking man, once I get to this, that will satisfy. And maybe it does for a minute, but you know this insatiable appetite for more. You know it all too well. Is it possible that that's never actually going to fulfill you? So like, oh no, it wasn't this salary amount, it's this salary amount. Oh, it's not this square footage, it's that square footage. It's not this many followers, it's this many followers. Whatever it is for you. Is it possible that that is a never-ending treadmill? Jesus' parable raises the question of all of us, what is behind my pursuit of more? Maybe we can all wrestle with this question this week. Do I own my stuff or does my stuff own me? Because some of us have become disciples of the American dream. Like we bought into the gospel of materialism. And we still maybe have, good church activity and church attendance, maybe even a small group, but we've really bought into like, this is where the good life is. That's where fulfillment is found. And while there's nothing wrong with the white picket fence and the 2.5 kids, many of us are believing that those things will ultimately satisfy us, and God is saying no. And if we don't stay on guard, if we don't keep watch, we will find ourselves focusing more on keeping up with the Joneses than following the way of Jesus. I love the way that Psalm 39 reads. It says, in vain they rush about, heaping up wealth without knowing whose it will finally be. I like to call this a sassy psalm, right? It's sort of like, man, they keep piling bigger and bigger piles, more and more stuff. Do they not know whose it will all finally be? It's living as if like I'm the king of the universe. My friends, the kingdom of God comes with a king, and it's not you, and it's not me. And that's actually really, really good news. It's all his. We are simply managers of his portfolio. We are stewards of whatever it is that he's given us here on planet Earth. So what is Jesus' answer to the problem of greed? He calls us to attach our hearts to something else. He invites us into a kingdom vision when he says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Seek first his kingdom, to see with kingdom lens. Seek first that. You will find the satisfaction that your heart longs for. And yet we've gotten it so backwards, I think, about what the blessed life actually means. I think it's worth noting. The New Testament uses the word blessed 112 times, and not once is it connected to material wealth. Is it possible that we've been duped? That we have bought the lie that having more will lead to ultimate satisfaction? Jesus says, seek first my kingdom. We'll find our deepest desires in Jesus and his kingdom. The truth is, and maybe you've never heard this before, you can have peace and the abundant life right here and now. It's found only in Jesus. It's not just simply life when you die, but life and life abundantly. He tells us in John 10, life to the full. I don't know about you, that's the kind of life that I long for. This is why Paul instructs Timothy to teach them to be generous so they can take hold of the life that is truly life. That's what God longs for us, not simply focus on me and mine for the 80, 90 years that we get here and then we're gone. The life Jesus offers his followers is not going to be found in materialism. It's found in living out the gospel of God's kingdom, living with eternity in mind. And there's an illustration that I saw a pastor named Francis Chan do years ago. I think it was 20 years ago now. And I tried so hard to come up with a better version of this, but I just couldn't. So I'm just going to steal his. And it so resonated with me over these 20 years. He had this illustration. He had this big old rope. And he said, imagine that this rope is the timeline of your life. This whole rope is the timeline of your life. And this blue part here is your time on earth. Let's say you get 100 years, which is unlikely for most of us. But let's just say we get 100 years on planet Earth. Some of us spend so much time focused on this part right here without any sense of the eternal impact of our choices. All of us have an eternity ahead of us in some way, shape, or form, and yet so many of us are like, I'm going to work hard, save hard right here so I can enjoy it like this last half inch right here. That's the dream, right? If I could just do that. We'll have a nice house. We'll have a nice car. We'll eat nice food. We just focus right here, and we just miss entirely the impact and the weight of eternity. And this is only a few feet. I feel like this doesn't adequately illustrate it. So I'm going to ask my friend Pastor Stone to help me with this example a little bit. If you could just grab this. And just walk down the aisle a bit there to really illustrate a little bit. Take a few steps. Some of you were not expected to be on camera today. I'm so sorry. Okay, yeah, all right. Stop there. Okay. Now compare it. The length of that rope right here, 100 years. Okay, go a little further. Would you just, keep walking back. Keep going. I don't know if y'all are aware, eternity is long. It goes on for a while. Okay, you can stop there. Okay. Now look at the length of the rope compared to this. 100 years of life and breath on planet Earth. Okay, you know what, I feel like that's not quite it. Can you just keep on going? Just keep on walking if you would. Would you just head all the way to the lobby, would you? That would be helpful. Yeah, let me just kind of get this. Yeah. That middle part, I don't know what's happening there in eternity. We'll ask you just when we get there. Into the lobby. Just go all the way. Yeah, freak someone out who's over there right now. Just keep going. The point is, we can't see the end of eternity. Like, we can't even in our finite brains fathom it. But we are told that we are going to spend an eternity somewhere. And yet so many of us are so hyper-focused on just this part. This is why I believe that Paul says things like, man, I run like a runner, with my eyes fixated on the prize, the goal. It's so easy to get distracted by this. The Bible tells us what we do with this will impact eternity. And I know it's a little cheesy, but bear with me. Some of you were, hopefully all of you were handed this string when you came in. And some of you, maybe you're looking at your neighbors and you're realizing that someone else's blue is longer than yours. That's not a prophetic word about, but I'm just like wildly sentimental, and here's what I would love for us to do. For the rest of this series, the next few weeks, just tie this somewhere that you'll see it every single day. Tie it to your keys right now, your steering wheel, bathroom mirror, whatever it is. As a reminder that, yes, be present in the here and now, but God, help me to have an eternal perspective. I don't know about you, I don't want to just simply be rich here and now, but not rich toward God. I'm tired of trying to build my little K kingdom. I'm telling you, it's not where life and flourishing is found. Do we work hard? Absolutely. Do we strive for excellence? Absolutely. But may we not forget, this is but a whisper compared to eternity. What are we doing with what we have with eternity in mind? I would say it this way. It's not wrong to ask God to bless you. It's wrong to keep it to yourself when he does. It's not wrong to say, God, would you bless my family, bless my business, but whatever that is. It's not wrong to ask God to bless you. In fact, I believe the father heart of God loves it when his kids ask for good stuff. It's not wrong to ask him to bless you. It is wrong to keep it to yourself when he does. God, help me to see through a kingdom lens, not an Ian lens, not just a here and now lens. With this farmer at his funeral, I imagine everyone in the community talked about how successful he was, how smart he was, how knowledgeable he was. People remarked about his work ethic. They reminisced about his marketing genius and what a visionary he was. They took his casket out to the gravesite. They buried it, put up the gravestone with the dates of his life and a statement about how smart, successful he was. And then they went home. And God looks at that man and says, fool, you missed it. I realize that sounds harsh of God almost. Is it possible that he wants us to really get this? To be rich in the things that matter. It's not that this man wanted too much. I would argue he wanted too little. His vision was obscured. He was thinking only about me and mine. He didn't want too much. He just wanted way too little. I wonder if this is why the psalmist says, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. We are not guaranteed anything. Some of us know that all too well. And Jesus is also not saying add a little bit of religious activity to your wealth and you're good. It's not what he's saying at all. He's saying to be truly rich is to be rich toward God. True wealth isn't what we have, it's who we become to God. It's not about what we can get, but about what we can give. To be rich to God is to say, I give you everything I have and everything I am. Not just my Sundays, not just this little portion that I've kind of set aside that I'm comfortable with. You can be broke and rich toward God. Later in Luke, we see a story of a widow with 2 mites that Jesus celebrates because she gave out of abundance. She gave out of everything that she had. That was an abundant part of being rich toward God. So how do we get rich toward God? I think this is the key. The key is to see how Jesus has been rich toward us. Everything that Jesus was entitled to, he gave up freely. He didn't consider equality with God something to cling to hold on to. He emptied himself and was obedient all the way to death on a cross. He owed us nothing and gave us everything. That is a miracle, friends. This is why I think Paul writes in 2 Corinthians that he was rich, yet for our sake became poor, so that through his poverty we might become rich. Jesus has been very rich to us because he's given us his very life. When we receive from him, you're rich. You have everything you need in Christ. And as we see the richness of Jesus in singing, in teaching, in a moment in communion, it cracks open our hearts and the grip of everything else begins to loosen. I think it's so fascinating that the story begins with the brother demanding some inheritance. God has shared his inheritance with us. It's given so freely to us when we could do nothing to earn or deserve or merit his favor or affection while we were still sinners. He comes after us. And you want a picture of true riches. That's it. Everything then we have, we are free to offer back to God. To see all of life as a gift. To impact not just the few years that we have here, not just that, but all of eternity. May God begin to loosen our grip on the things that we see and to help us to live with eternity in mind, to make an impact far beyond ourselves.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on our YouTube channel today. I hope that you felt the welcome home of Christ right through your screen. Here we believe that the gospel is good news worth sharing. So if you'd like to share this stream with your friends and family, you can also subscribe to this channel and you can use @BridgeChurchTN. Also, if you'd like to give, there's a link in the description there you can click and it'll walk you through all the steps. And if you'd like to stay connected with us, you can simply head on over to bridge.tv. Hope to see you again soon.